this group come up. This is Simcom, right?
Yes. We're going to show you a video of the important work that our leader that we got a chance to interview, Wally David, and the kingdom work that he is doing. And might have a little technical difficulty, but try to pay close attention. This is an animated version, but the actual flight communications for the flight 1549 that landed in the Hudson River. Okay.
Hold on 1 second. Oops. It's not working. Oh, it's gonna work.
We could act it out.
This is the interpretive dance part of our. What this does portray is the incredible poise that this. That's not it. No, that's actual plane. That this captain who flying this aircraft and how he handled himself. And as you recall, as this airliner was taking off, it ran into a flock of Canadian geese and it destroyed the engines. And he had to turn around and he landed in the Hudson and there were no fatalities. It was just an incredible, and his voice in it was so calm. And the gentleman that we interviewed trains pilots and helps them to do better at what they do. And they will simulate things like this. And so this is important kingdom work that this entrepreneur, this businessman, Wally, was involved in. And Wally David he does flight simulator training. And he started a little over 24 years ago, and with 3 employees and 1 simulator. And today he has over 300 employees in 4 locations and 55 simulators. And this was just an incredible story of a man who had actually no interest, not particular interest in flight. He was interested in business, he was an entrepreneur, he was gifted in those areas, and became interested in this arena. What I'm going to do right now is, in keeping with our motif, is I will be handing or flying an airplane onto your table. And because we know it's later in the afternoon, I want you to stand up, the one person in there, and face the rest of us and read the question, and then our panel will, and I will ask you, will answer the question.
How did you work together as a team?
You can shoot it at me. Go ahead. Yeah, my name is David Marshall. I'm with LD in the Mid-Atlantic region, and that's a really fun question for me to answer. I know when I first came and when we found out what we're going to be doing this challenge, I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I texted my wife and I just said, I'm petrified right now. I said, we're in this group of leaders, and maybe some of you guys were feeling the same. You didn't know what your contribution was going to be. You knew everybody could lead. Most of us are used to leading individually, but what does it look like to lead with a team of a group of leaders? And so that was really a challenge for me to think about. And I just sketched out what I would do. And so it was kind of fun. We were hosting the meeting in my room, and so when I got up there, it was just real easy for me to get together the team and for us to just pray, to be able to say, hey, let's talk about our best contributions and what that's going to look like. So here's a few things that we looked at. We identified each other's strengths, and that was really fun to hear, just that each of us had different strengths that we would be able to contribute to that conversation. And the other thing that we did was we looked at how we could use those strengths. And then one of the things that I've been learning a lot, we have a new ethnic field ministry director for our region. And he's been really educating us in the area of minority culture and majority culture. And so we're able to just talk real openly and honestly about, hey, real quick, let's just identify that we have a majority culture here, and what does that look like to function in communication in that situation, and how we function and work together as a team. And so we talked about that briefly and just kind of identified, hey, that's something we might have to work through in our discussions. The other thing that we did was we laid down some mutual expectations before the interview began. It was really enjoyable as we were going through the process, and Jenny did a phenomenal job of saying, hey, I really enjoy strategic planning. And so we set up for her to be able to kind of look at the strategic planning process, and for her to bring us into that, and for us to speak into that process. And so at the end of that time, I felt like we had a really clear plan going into our time with Wally David. And that really helped. We were able to bounce around, but we knew exactly what we were going to do, how we were going to work off of each other. And as you guys knew, probably working with your teams, there's a lot of strong personalities in this room. And so there was just an open discussion about how we were going to not dominate a conversation or dominate a discussion. And Jenny just really did a fantastic job of bringing us together as a team in that way. And then everybody was able to own their part in the meeting, but just being able to be flexible. And then when we came back today, we just talked about, hey, is there somebody who would do a better job at helping us to put together the presentation? So Brian said, hey, I'd be willing to step up to that. And so it was just really fun seeing how we function and work together as a team.
Wally is a passionate person. Oh, my name is Melody, sorry. And so it was great when we sat down after we met with him, and we all kind of like were sharing what we learned. It was obvious that his heart came out for a lot of us, that who he was as a person and how he ran his business is what we all valued a lot. And so he leads his business from a Christian perspective, but he would clearly state that it's not a Christian organization. And he kind of told us his story, and I was intrigued by his story. So he came about being, the CEO of Simcom because he was unemployed for a while. And it was through that unemployment process that he really surrendered his life to Christ and kind of gave the lordship of it. He was kind of driven on success. He was in the finance world. And so through this unemployment time, he really was able to trust the Lord. And so he had his first test kind of right when the business started up. And so he had some investors. There were 4 Jewish men in Ohio, and they were giving a lot of money. And they wanted him to co-sign a loan so that he would be invested with them. And so as he, is talking to him, he goes back that night and prays, and he really feels like the Lord telling him, this is not a good idea to be unequally yoked with these people. I don't think it's wise. And so he goes into this meeting not knowing if he is going to get, the loan and the money, and risking it, and basically telling him, I can't sign the loan with you. And the guys were like, okay, that's fine. And they still signed the loan, and it's good. But he said that was huge for him and his business because it was the first time that he really trusted the Lord and took the right approach, the ethical approach, the Christian point of view from it, and went with it. And he said that helped him as he continued to make decisions along the way. He said 3 things that really stood out to him as a leader that makes him an effective leader, and it is character, integrity, and consistency. And so it's being consistent in whatever you do, and it's having the people that work underneath him knowing that he has their best interest at heart. And so I know, too, for me, that can be hard to be consistent all the time, but it was an encouragement, to hear that that's so important. You mentioned it numerous times, just that's a huge value of being consistent in the way that you are treating everybody around you, and doing that all the time. There was one last question we asked about grace and truth, and this I feel like relates to the way, Crew nationally as we work. And he was very honest, and so we asked him, how does this apply to you and your business? And he says, I feel like in the church world and ministry, he's like, we're usually a little more grace-oriented. And he's like, but in business, he's like, truth, I have to be more truth-oriented. And he's like, because the product and my training and what I do, I need to put out the best product. And he's like, people's lives are on the line. And so I need to make sure, that what I put out is good. And so if the person is not in the right role or is not fit for the position, they can't stay in it, which I thought was really cool. And I feel like we've mentioned it in some of the other talks, having the right person, in the bus in the right seat. But that's huge. Is I feel like even for me with my team is making sure, is everybody in the right position? Are they, in a position where their strengths are being used and they're being utilized? Because we're in the business of saving lives too. And so we need to make sure, that people are in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, throw it at me. Take your aggression down. I didn't make that airplane. I just want you to know that, all right? When you think about the coaching role, it's very interesting. In leadership development, we're constantly thinking about how we can help our staff develop to accomplish the mission. And so I was thinking about that in the context of that question. And one of the things that he said that really captured my attention was that we cannot have any ineffective people. And I thought to myself, sometimes I think within our organization we do have people who are ineffective. We may not know exactly what they're doing. We don't know what's going on. I've had staff that have said, hey, I had this role within crew, and to be honest with you, I didn't really even know what I was supposed to be doing, or I didn't know if what I was really doing mattered. And it was interesting to hear him talk about in a corporation where there's millions of dollars at stake, he's not looking to lose any money, and ineffective people will cause him to lose money. So it was interesting, as he said, one of the things that's most important is that the people need to know what their job is. And that sounds simple, but I think there's a lot of times even within our organization where I had to ask myself the question, do people really know what their job is? Do they know what it takes to move the ball on the field and to get to the places that they want to be by the end of the year? And if you have people who are doing that, then they need to have clear results. What am I expected to know and to do that's going to cause me to be successful? And when I think about my role in leadership development and the significance of Shannon and Ryan, who are my bosses, they've talked over and over and over again about the cycle of development, about having a position focus. And I heard somebody earlier today say, hey, in my job I had 2 position focuses or 2 reviews in 10 years or something like that. You thought that's really difficult to have a sense of effectiveness in that context. And so we want to have results. And then the last thing that really connected with me was, what does accountability look like with that? How do we keep people accountable to that? And I think so oftentimes we're caught in the whirlwind and the busyness of our jobs day in and day out. And I know that's true for myself. Emails coming in and flowing. And so it's really caused me to think through, hey, how am I going to keep my team? How am I going to help those who lead within the region to keep their folks accountable so that, not so we can remove ineffective people, although at times that's necessary. And it was really fun to hear him talk about, well, fun's probably not the right word. But he's very, very direct. He makes decisions that need to be made in order to move his company where it needs to go. And so for me, I really walked away from that time going, you know what? I need to really think through how I can help keep the folks that I'm responsible for more accountable to the results and that they have a clear picture of what the job is. And so it was really, really awesome.
Brian Burchell. I was really impressed with Wally in a lot of ways, but one was how values really drove his direction. He had 3 values for the company, and he discovered those by understanding how competitors were not meeting the needs of customers. And those 3 values are personal, friendly, and value, so that flight training would be personal, so they have 2 people in a class. It would be friendly. They would treat people, their clientele, with friendliness and warmth, and value, that it would be good value for the money. They would get a lot more out of their dollar. 3 examples of this that I noticed in our interview. One is how he chose to spend money. He gave the example of a client who said, hey, we would love to have a curved screen in your simulator, So rather than making a decision himself, Wally brought the question back to him, and he said, well, let me ask you this. If if I were to do that, would you spend an extra $200 per class? And the man was very thoughtful and determined that, I really don't need a curved screen for an extra $200. And so that drove his decision in that. And so he came up with another principle. He said, anything better than good enough destroys value. And what he means by that is that if you have something like a curved screen that's better than good enough, the customer doesn't want it. It destroys value for him. He's paying too much for what he wants. New customers might not come, and existing customers might not return. A second example of how he led and set direction by values is how they grow as a company. And I asked him, well, what are your plans for expanding as a company? Are you looking to expand as far as your competitors? He said, well, that's really determined by our ability to work within our niche, which are those three values: the personal, the friendliness, and value. And then that would define how far they go. So he wasn't thinking, by 2020 I want to have, do $20 million of revenue, or I want to do, have 20 sites, that sort of thing. It was by values. And then the third example is how he makes decisions. He takes generally a consultative approach. In a lot of cases, he takes input, he welcomes debate from his team, and then he makes the decision, and then he builds alignment around the decision. A personal takeaway for me with regard to Wally, it was mentioned before, his high leader value is consistency, integrity and consistency. He says people want to follow leaders who are consistent. And that really came out of my 360 a bit, that I need to grow in that area. And then the other thing related to that is his emotional intelligence and emotional management. There were two moments when he was touched emotionally, one related to his conversion and one related to some people whose lives were saved because of his work. And he, when he was telling his story, he simply paused, and everyone knew he was emotional, but he didn't react. He paused, contained himself, and moved forward. And I really love that, because my EQI says that I'm highly empathetic and I'm highly expressive. And so I need to grow in that area as well so I can stay in the game and lead with consistency.
Thank you for asking. Two very important things that I learned is that I don't like dressing up in a suit. So first thing I did when I came back was change. Second thing that I learned in our 24-hour group is I thought Koreans were intense and hardworking, but I think Olive Crew is very intense and hardworking. But I think we all know that change is hard. I know change is hard, and I think that's what makes being a change agent a very challenging task. It's harder being a change agent because change is so hard. And in the midst of all the changing times and challenges, the way Wally showed us how he played the role as a change agent, as a leader, as a CEO of his company, was something that I really took away from our time together with him. And I think some of the things that he shared with us was so applicable to our context in Crew. And so one of the things that he shared was that change, he doesn't change for the sake of change, or you don't always change things because it seems good, but you change based upon principles. And so some changes are good, some changes are unnecessary. And how do you make that decision? Well, he said principles don't change, strategies rarely change, but tactics must change according to the changed times. And so to give you an example of that is something that Brian touched upon is in his purchasing, the principle that he goes by is there's changing technology happening all the time with the new graphics that brings about better simulation experience, better screens, and all those things that are available. So will he, purchase those things so that he can bring better change and greater experience in simulation training? No, because they don't add value, meaning they don't bring profit. And customers are not looking for those things at a greater cost out of their pocket. And so those changes are not, it doesn't meet the criteria or the principle of the company. So he'll say no to that kind of change. But what kind of change does Wally say yes to is the kind of change that is consistent with the value of the company, which is one of the principles that they had, or not principles, but one of the policies that they had was no negotiation policy, which means for the new clients or new customers, they've never negotiated the price. But what they had found as they went through the recession times, that the customers were changing, that their loyal customers stayed with the company, not because of the cost, but because of the kind of services that they were receiving, personalized and friendly customer service. And that's what they were staying. And so money wasn't playing a factor in whether they continued to stay with the company or not. And so instead of offering them the discount or the incentive of the discount, they decided to move the discount or that incentive to the new customer, which before they had a policy against, because with the recession, they started to discover that the customers are now shopping. And they're calling different places and was looking for more competitive prices, and his competitors were also competing with the price. And so though that was their policy in the beginning, they decided to change that policy and started to offer incentives and discounts to new customers without forfeiting the profit margin. The way he came about these decisions or these changes was by listening. And I think that was one of the key principles about being a good change agent, is that he listened well. And one of the things that he said in sharing with us was that, if you're in a system for a long time, longer you're in the system, harder it is to change the system. And he's been with the company for 24 years. So how does he continue to maintain being a change agent? By listening. And he knew that the people with the best ideas are people who are closest to the customers. And so he opened his ears to the salespeople. And the idea of having an incentive and offering discount to the new clients was actually an idea that came from the salespeople. And he listened and he adjusted his policy so that he can change with the changing time. And this was something that was consistent in his journey as a CEO, because in the beginning stage, when he took over the company and he became the CEO, he knew nothing about flying or being in this industry. And so what he had done, he shared with us, was that for first few years, every twice a week he would spend twice a week he would have lunch with his customers, and he made sure that got placed into his schedule consistently, so that he could be listening to his customers and find out what were their needs and how can they meet that need better. And so for me, the walk away from this is change is hard, and trying to bring change, even to my context back in New York City, is hard. How do I bring that change? I need to have better listening skills. I need to listen to the students as well as to the younger staff and have my ears open. But and have a learning posture in that process. But also to know what our principles are, and to know what is not negotiable, and to know what is negotiable. Methods, tactics. What are some things that can change, and what are things that we need to hold on to, because that is the principle of what we're doing.
Great question. You know, I really wanted that question because it's one of the questions that I'm learning to ask myself. How people, do they experience me? And I asked that even to the group, how did we experience Wally? And what did he actually do that we could, not what he said necessarily, but what did he do with us there? And he was an excellent spokesperson. Now, and I would probably preface that, I don't think that was a natural thing for him, would be my guess. He was more like an accounting. Great. He also demonstrated just good people skills. We asked him, what was some of the things that is important of a leader and that he looks for, and he said, people skills, and he demonstrated this. He had good eye contact with us. He just looked around the boardroom as he was talking to us. And then he engaged us. He asked us questions and went through each person and had them answer the question. And it was very similar to the question that he asked you, metrics and things. And we got into some good conversation. And he had follow-up questions, so he demonstrated what was already mentioned, sincerely listening. So we experienced Wally as a leader, and that was awesome. I want to close our time with similarly to how he closed our time with him, and he did that telling a story. He personalized or personified his training, and he said in the year from a 1-year period in 2011 to 2012. Exactly 1 year, the kind of planes that he trains toward, there were 8 crashes in the United States. He assessed each one of those that had to do with his aircraft so they can learn from that. And this is what he said. He said each one of those pilots called Simcom. Each one of those pilots declined the training. And he said this, he had to pause. And then he related that very personally. He says, one of the planes, there was a family of 5, and 4 of them were on the plane. And as they approached, one of the things, he knew exactly what happened, and it was one of the training things that they do. It was a single-engine aircraft. The engine failed, and as he tried to make the approach a common failure, this pilot demonstrated the common failure and landed short, and everyone on the plane was killed. There was only 4 of them on the plane, and there was a 13-year-old daughter back in Ohio, I believe it was, that survived. And then he says, what do you say to that daughter? So he brought it home. And he told this story, as was mentioned earlier, he had to pause because of the emotion of it. And again, I don't think this is a real emotional guy. But, we asked him the question, he says, we turned to kind of on, he says, what makes you effective? And one of the things that he mentioned was the kind of person that people follow. And I said, what does that, what does that mean? What is that like? And he kind of, but it's this notion of a heart and a character. And I think all of us came away from that meeting looking at Wally and saying, this is the kind of man we would follow.
Q&A time. But thank you for that. Yeah. But it's a good pause after your story, don't you think? Something to think about.
Questions before I call on people.
I think in the beginning when you hear that, you know, you're sort of like, that's not necessarily a pursuit of excellence, right? When you settle for good enough. And I think sometimes even in crew, we have tendency to think that way, that everything excellent is everything good. But I think just even our time here as an example of, you know, good enough is, you know, SLI design team decided to give us less than 2 hours to prepare for this presentation. Our presentation is but good enough, right? Had we been given 20 hours, we would have presented an excellent presentation. But it's good enough for the training that, you know, they desire, training effect they desire to have, right? 20 hours might have been waste of time for the kind of training result results that they wanted. And so I think that's a good example of, you know, good enough.
Just real quickly, I think that Wally's standard for good enough is excellence. And what he would say is good enough would be meeting the need in an excellent manner.
We wanted to. We were thinking Disney World kind of stuff. No, actually, we did get to go in one. It was the Cessna training thing, and it's an actual cockpit of a Cessna aircraft. It was pretty cool. We didn't get to experience any of that because they were occupied and they're really expensive and stuff. Yeah, like what is it like? The least expensive training was $5,000 for so.
Just a quick note, Wally had me in there one time, we were walking around, I think it was with one of the SLI groups, I can't remember, but the guy who was driving the thing crashed big time. I mean, like, went straight down into the runway. Like, it's like, how in the world? Wally's like, how did that happen? So, it was kind of an interesting little shock.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. It was actually pretty fun at the leadership development time just in Colorado a month ago or so. I had to take the defense for truth, and it was really enjoyable because I think as an organization we don't do a good job. We're very gracious, but the truth side is really important. I think the question I always ask myself is, how do we present that truth? But we have to be truthful. We have to be able to be honest and give people the development that they need to speak into their lives, to tell them if they're doing a great job and to tell them if they're not doing a good job. And I think we rob people of their ability to grow in specific areas if we're not truthful. And I think as an organization we could do a better job at that. I'm not going to give the talk right now, but
Yeah, I would agree. I think we could go more to the truth side. We do grace really, really well. But there are times, I think, when people are in positions that might not necessarily need to be in that position, or they need, you know, more development in areas. And I think out of fear of rocking the boat or having to deal with the repercussions of the person or the way that it might affect the team, it's not worth it. He made a comment that he asked about hiring, and he said, you know, it's usually the second decision after 90 days that really is the big decision. So he said, you know, you hire somebody, they can fake it initially. He's like, but after 90 days, you kind of get to know the person. And he's like, after 90 days, if they're not in the right position, he's like, then you got to get them out of there. And he's like, it's hard because you have to go through the hiring process again. It takes a lot of work, but he's like, but it's worth it. And so I think that's at times what we need to do more often than not.
In LDHR, we often talk about managing the tension between the organization and the individual, their interests, and one of our wise counselors, Laurie, who said this offline, by the way, Mark. She didn't give us a lot of input. But she said that that's a false dichotomy, that really the best, often the best decision for the organization is the best decision for the individual and vice versa. So if someone's not in the right place, it's not doing them any favors to leave them there.
Question in the front here.
So Wally mentioned, you guys mentioned this as well, like you said that strategy rarely changes, but tactics must change over time. So you have any thoughts on how that might relate to crew, or specifically maybe your roles or where you're working?
That was a great question. It's worth articulating. Go ahead. I have my glasses on.
Strategy rarely changes, but tactics must change over time.
And so how should that be applied in crew? I think I was impressed with Wally is that he observed how his environment had changed in a fundamental ways toward his industry. And he had to adjust to that. He had to adjust his tactics. His values and his principles remained the same. But he talked about how some of his promotional things worked out. He says with the environment that he's in now, he says post 9/11 was a big deal. It changed things. And so as we apply that, all measurements in our culture since I've joined staff 30 years ago, it has changed dramatically. Has our paradigms and our methodology changed with it to where we're still principally the same way, what drives those? And I think there's some assumptions that we make that really need to be reassessed, that we need to think through some things for our objective. See, what does it mean to fulfill the Great Commission in the 21st century? Not in the middle part of the 20th century. Our world is different. And I think probably clearly that we no longer live in Jerusalem metaphorically. We really live in Babylon. And the way the church is instructed to live in a Babylon context is different than a Jerusalem context. Thinking that through for our methodology will I think, and like Wally said, his survivability, you have to adapt in the business world for survivability, and it'll affect, I think, us as well. You guys got thoughts on that one?
Just on a campus level, I think there's a direct correlation. So for example, on a campus level, our strategy is win, build, send, or win, build, train, send. Our tactics would have to change though. So I think, I've staffed through like 90s when evangelism on campus wasn't working. And so everybody was throwing out evangelism out the window. But that's a strategy that we should have, I think, held dear to and protected and really question the methodology and tactic, whereas not giving up on evangelism. And so, that's some of the things that we're revisiting where evangelism is definitely at the core DNA of Crew as well as our strategy, but how do we make it more effective in the way we engage people or in our methodology? If forced spiritual law is no longer effective, how do we go about presenting the gospel that's in a transferable way that we can effectively disciple other people? That would be tactic, I think.
We're glad to show you the video at another time.
Thanks, Gary. You tripled my support after.
Yeah,